This segment is the second segment of Module 5A. This segment focuses on the first step of the SLO development process, gather and review available data. If you have not completed Segment 1 yet, please exit this presentation and complete Segment 1 before returning to this segment.
The first step of the SLO development process is to gather and review available data. During this step, we will complete the baseline and trend data and student population components of the SLO template. As you will remember from earlier modules, teachers will want to review baseline data, data on current students' performance, and trend data, data on how their students performed in the course in prior years, and/or data on how your current students have performed over time. Most likely, teachers will not have all of this information available to them, but teachers should have enough information to help them identify student strengths and weaknesses. Examples of baseline data are listed in this slide. Baseline data can include current and prior years pre-assessment data, and of course achievement data from prior years, student portfolios, and work samples from prior years or the beginning of the course. In some cases, teachers also may want to examine student performance in a similar subject. For example, a Physics 1 teacher might look at mathematics scores to get a sense of students' familiarity with algebraic equations. Examining multiple sources of available data can give teachers a more complete picture of student performance and help them identify student strengths and weaknesses. For example, a review of prior year end-of-course achievement data may give a broad sense of how poorly or well students did in the prerequisite course last year, but pre-assessment data can supplement this information by providing information about students' specific knowledge and skills in relation to the current course. In addition, teachers will also want to gather information about your students' context. Information contained in individualized education plans, IEPs, written education plans, 504 plans, and other documents can provide additional information about student learning needs and the factors that might make it difficult for some students to reach typical growth targets. For your purposes today, you will be using Mrs. Wilson's IEP and 504 Plan Summary Snapshot contained in Handout 5A.4. In addition to baseline data, teachers should gather and review trend data if they are available. Trend data can be two things. Trend data can be data on prior students' performance in the course. This information can be valuable for two reasons. First, it helps teachers anticipate which content and skills of your course may be more challenging for students to master. Second, it can help teachers gauge what sort of progress can be expected between the pre-assessment and post-assessment for current students, provided that you have this information available and your student population is similar. For example, if you taught an honors class last year and are teaching a remedial class this year, trend data will not be as useful as if you taught a mixed ability class last year and are teaching a mixed ability class again this year and will be using the same assessments. Trend data can also be information about your current group of students over time. For example, if you are a 5th grade teacher, you might have information about how your students scored on the Ohio Academic Assessments in grades 3 and 4 and notice a trend that students score poorly in data analysis. If you have not already reviewed the data contained in Handouts 5A.4, 5A.5, 5A.6, and 5A.7, please pause in a few moments to do so. When completing your analysis of Mrs. Wilson's data, you will need to summarize your review of baseline data. When analyzing data, it can be useful to include both numbers and narrative. Tables can be useful in summarizing information. For example, from the table on this slide, we can determine that, on average, students have some understanding of cycles of patterns of Earth and Moon, although the scores of individual students ranged in this area. Scientific inquiry seems to be an area where students may need additional support, since the average score was 7 out of 20 in this area. Teachers also will need to identify the student's strengths and weaknesses. Keep in mind that if teachers only identify strengths or if teachers only identify weaknesses, the SLO will not be approved because identification of both is required by the SLO Template Checklist used in approving SLOs. This is why breaking down information by topic or skill area can be important. In addition, Teachers also should determine where students usually do well and where they struggle in the course based upon trend data. For example, the table from handout 5A.6 summarizes the performance of Mrs. Wilson's prior students on the science post-assessment in previous years. From this chart, we can determine that scientific inquiry and data analysis seem to be areas where students do not do as well. Conversely, students generally do well with cycles of patterns of Earth and Moon. One thing to consider when reviewing these data is that the assessment this year is different than the one administered in prior years. In this scenario, Mrs. Wilson does not have trend data on how her students fared in the past. If she did have this trend data, she would be able to make a better informed judgment of whether areas of weaknesses have been persistent over time. Please turn now to your SLO template. This template is available in Microsoft Word form on the ODE website and in Handout 5A.1. You should remember from prior trainings that the SLO template consists of 7 components. Based upon what we have just discussed about Mrs. Wilson's data, complete the baseline and trend data section of the SLO template. Pause here and summarize your analysis in this section of the template. I mentioned earlier that you will be using the SLO Template Checklist to make sure that you have met the minimum criteria for each component of the SLO. Please review the baseline and trend data component of your SLO to make sure that you can check off all of the applicable boxes. If you cannot, please revise this section before returning to the module. Please pause now to conduct your review and make any revisions as necessary. We provide an annotated SLO as a separate handout so that you can compare your SLO to the sample, but throughout this presentation we will highlight some of the key information you should have included in your SLO, or for some components, samples of what the component might look like for Mrs. Wilson's SLO. For the baseline and trend data component, you should have described the pre-assessment. Include information about when it was administered and that it is aligned to appropriate standards. You should have included tables of data and then discussed what the data mean. For example, you should have discussed how the data suggests students vary in their knowledge and skills. You should have noted those areas where students appear to have the most background knowledge and skill and where they have the least. Finally, you should have included some reference to the trend data while noting that the data are based on a different version of the assessment. After summarizing baseline and trend data, teachers will need to describe their students. Keep in mind that it may not always be possible or preferable to enter student population information before identifying the content of the SLO, especially if the teacher is writing a targeted SLO. However, one of the 2 SLOs required must be a course-level SLO. Because this module is focusing on creating a course-level SLO, we can complete this step before reviewing content. All of the students in Mrs. Wilson's class will be included in the student population. In this section, you will need to specify the number of students in the class or course, the grade level of students, and any contextual factors that may impact growth. In a rare case that a teacher has a student with extenuating circumstances, the teacher might exclude an individual student from a course-level SLO. This exclusion should be noted in the student population section and would need to be approved by the principal. Identify how many students are special needs or gifted, and list their area of identification. If this is a reading class and the student is identified as special needs or gifted in mathematics, it may still apply, but not as strongly as if the student was identified in reading. In addition, please refer to the last box of the checklist under the student population section. This box would only be applicable if you and your administrator had agreed to exclude a subgroup of students from your SLO. If no subgroups were excluded from your SLO, you should explicitly state this so the approval committee knows it is not applicable to your SLO. Please turn to Handout 5A.4. This handout provides a snapshot of student learning needs captured in IEPs and 504 plans. This document provides information about each student's diagnosis and goal areas, the accommodations and modifications the student is entitled to receive both during regular instruction and during testing, and information about additional medical needs. This information will be helpful in describing the student population, but please keep in mind that protected information, such as student names and student ID numbers, should remain confidential. Summarizing the needs of your class without using student names is appropriate, but submitting a document similar to Handout 5A.4 with your SLO would not be appropriate. When writing your SLO, please make sure you protect the privacy of your students. As you are writing, look at the SLO Template Checklist to make sure you are meeting the required criteria of these two components. Remember, your SLO will likely be approved by a local committee, as recommended by ODE. Therefore, when writing SLOs, it is critical to include pertinent details, even though they may be well known to the classroom teacher. Because the committee members may not be as familiar with our classroom as the teacher, teachers need to be as clear and complete as possible when writing their SLOs. Pause now to complete the student population section of the SLO and then resume the recording when you are ready to proceed. The description of the student population on this slide meets the criteria for this component. Mrs. Wilson identifies who is included in this SLO and includes relevant details about the course, grade level, and number of students. She identifies which students may struggle to meet targets or will need to receive accommodations or modifications during instruction, such as ELL students and students with IEPs and 504 plans. Mrs. Wilson does not exclude subgroups of students taking her course from student population, but she does explain why gifted and talented students are not in her student population. These students take a separate course.
This concludes segment 2. The next segment will focus on the second step of the SLO development process: determine the interval of instruction and identify content. When you are ready to proceed with Module 5A, please open segment 3.